It's almost the middle of April and open water fishing season's in full swing. How do I know? Because I'm getting lots of emails about fishing tackle, and we're going to talk some of the very specifics on simplifying choosing your fishing tackle on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com, and they will ship directly to a store closest to you, and there's more than 140 of them around the country, so you've probably got one close by. And also, don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. They are raring to go to take care of all your truck and car needs at Toyota and Volvo as well in northern Colorado. So guys, it's the middle of April. Fishing's in full swing. I know because I got people out here fishing behind the house all the time now. And I also know because I had the first couple of bear sightings in the last 10 days. So the bears are out, the fishing must be good. And that's just how it is. So the other way I know, more on the human side, is that I get lots of emails this time of year about specific fishing tackle. Might be rods, might be reels, might be lures, whatever it is. But it's about choosing or selecting. It typically goes something like, hey Chad, big fan, blah, blah, blah. Wondering what you think I should buy for a fishing rod for this, or whatever the case might be. And I get those a lot. I love getting those. One of the blessings in my line of work is that people do want to ask questions, and I love to answer them. And given that I have educational background in aerospace engineering and I've studied fishing my whole life and I've worked with some of the best manufacturers out there, I have some strong opinions on fishing tackle in general. And I thought I would share some of that with you guys right now. And we'll just go through it by the individual pieces of tackle. I think that's probably the easiest way to do this. And if you have questions, if this brings up questions or any of my podcasts, and hopefully you're a subscriber, I think we've published 158 of them or something at this point, and 760 videos on our YouTube channel. If you have questions, not just about this one, but any of them, shoot me an email, chat@fishfulthinker, or message me somewhere, and I try to do my best to stay on top of all of those. So I'm going to roll right into it because this could be a big topic or it could be a little topic, just depending on how detailed I want to get with it. And so I'm going to try to keep from making this too tedious, but a couple things. So we'll start with the fishing rod. And really my premise is, how are we going to go about choosing this tackle? When you walk into a Sportsman's Warehouse and you decide you're going to buy a new fishing rod, or you're looking at them in a catalog or online or whatever the case might be, I want you to make some decisions, or make those decisions based on some education of what's built into that rod and what makes it appropriate for what it is. And I get enough questions about it that I think there's definitely misunderstandings for rods, reels, line choices, all of that. So we'll go through it now. Start with the rod. First thing, as with any fishing tackle, I want to know is, what are you going to do with it? So if you're going to send me an email and say, I need a new fishing rod, give me some idea of how you like to fish. If you're fishing primarily streams and you need to throw trout lures, well, I'm going to have a different suggestion than if you are maybe a bass guy or a walleye guy and you're going to be fishing from a boat, and I would have different suggestions than if you're throwing strictly bait and that's all you're doing, and I'll have a different suggestion there. So having some idea of what you want to do with your fishing tackle first will help a lot. And there is no such thing as one fishing rod that will suit all needs. So let me just clear that up right now. If you need a good all-around fishing rod, meaning I'm going to throw bait, I'm going to throw lures, I'm not going to fish a lot, I just want one fishing rod to do all of the above, that's a completely different question. And I can answer that one really quick. First of all, get an ugly stick, because you can't break it, you can't hurt it. These days they have whole different ranges of ugly sticks, which we'll talk about a little bit here in a second. But most importantly, get an ugly stick and get it in the closest weight that you normally throw day in and day out. So if you throw a half-ounce egg sinker all the time because you like to throw bait, well then get a rod that's rated for that. And that kind of leads into where I'm going with this whole rod thing. But a general all-around fishing rod, if there is such a thing, is going to be somewhere around a medium power, and it's going to be somewhere around 6 to 6.5 feet long, and it's going to be made out of a durable material, and that's about it. It's going to be a spinning rod as well. That's about it. And so if you're that guy, this is easy for you. Walk into a Sportsman's Warehouse, find that GX2 ugly stick, and buy a 6-footer and a medium power, and go about your business. Easy peasy. However, if you're a little bit more technical than that, let's talk about rods. First of all, if I'm looking for a rod for a finesse application, in other words, maybe a jig, a Texas rig, something where I'm going to have to feel what's going on really well, like a really sensitive rod, then I need to spend more money. And that money equates to a higher modulus of graphite that the blank is made out of. And modulus, I will spare you the details, but long story short, it makes the rod more responsive, lighter weight, and just generally more tactile to fish with. And when you spend more money, that's generally what you're headed for, is a higher modulus of graphite. Also, the components on that rod, the guides themselves will be lighter. The reel seat itself may be lighter as well. The guides being lighter is a much bigger deal than it sounds like, because it directly affects how the blank feels. But if you're looking for a finesse thing, you're going to be spending more money. If you're looking for a rod that you're going to be throwing a crankbait with, or something like that, a spinnerbait that you're just going to chuck and wind, or you're throwing inline spinners and spoons for trout, something like that, pike baits, things like that, then you don't need to spend as much money. You can buy a lower modulus of graphite, and you can get a rod that will perform well. And the difference is you won't have the sensitivity. The rod itself will be heavier, physically heavier, and it won't be as sensitive. But you don't need it to be as sensitive if you're winding your lure in all the time, or if you've just got bait sitting on the bottom and you're just going to let fish pick it up and swim away, like you might with a catfish or a trout bait or something like that. But if you are just going to hook and wind a bait, you don't need the sensitivity. If you're going to be finesse fishing, you need the sensitivity, and you therefore need to look at a higher modulus of graphite. And it will typically be put in some terms of, it'll literally say high modulus on it. It might have a ton rating, like a 30-ton or 20-ton rating, depends on the different manufacturers. But pick them up, you will notice right away the difference in cost, as well as the lightness and the weight of the rod. And that comes from the graphite that the rod's made from. All of my finesse rods are my most expensive rods. All of my Texas rig rods are in that same category. However, my crankbait rods, my spinnerbait rods, anything I would troll with, anything I would throw bait with, are all less expensive fishing rods. And one little caveat that no one likes to tell you, as a general rule, the lower modulus of graphite is a more durable rod as well. So you get a rod that costs less and is more durable, with the ugly stick being the ultimate example of that. It's extremely durable. It's got a very low modulus graphite fiberglass mix, which is what makes it so durable, but also why it's heavier, and so and why it's less ultimately crisp feeling in your hand. So keep those things in mind. Now, from there, I've decided I need a finesse rod, so I'm going to buy a higher modulus of graphite. Okay, got it. Now what? Next thing I'm going to look at is the length of that rod. And if accuracy is a key thing in your fishing, then the rod probably should be shorter, maybe in the 6 to 6.5 foot range. If you want ultimate controllability and fish fighting ability, and maybe a little bit less emphasis on accuracy, then you can be more in the 6.5 to 7 foot or even longer range. I'm a little dude for starters. I'm only 5'9", little scrawny guy. I don't generally like spinning rods in the say 7.5 or longer range. They get a little bit cumbersome. However, they are definitely very good at controlling fish. They are very good at making long throws and keeping your line off the water and things like that. So if you're a bigger guy, bigger hands, things like that, maybe you want to get an even longer spinning rod. But the next thing for me, like I said, with a finesse rod is going to be somewhere in the 6.5 foot range. Now, in my personal case, I prefer 6'8" to 6'10", maybe 7 foot on the outside for all of my finesse type rods. Is a good compromise of casting accuracy, line control, lure control of the actual bait itself in terms of steering the bait and things like that. And so that's where my finesse rods end up, and they're spinning rods. If we're talking about a Texas rig, like a bass fishing type rod, something like that, then we're going to have potentially a longer rod. Then you're talking about a casting rod for starters, not a spinning rod. And it's going to be potentially 7 to 7.5 feet long, maybe even longer. And again, in this scenario, I prefer 7 foot to 7'4". In fact, the only rods I have longer than 7'4" right now are either a big long crankbait rod or a swim bait rod. Everything else is shorter than that in my entire arsenal, and I have a significant arsenal of fishing rods, both spinning rods and casting rods. So that's where I'm going there, is the length. So a general rule, the easy answer, get a mid 6 foot, 6'6" to 6'10" range, and get it in a high modulus of graphite. The next thing I'm looking at after length is the power of that rod. And power and action often get confused. Power is how much force or effort or mass or whatever you want to look at it, it takes to put a bend in the rod. In other words, if I hung weight, if the rod was horizontal and I hung a weight off the tip of it, that amount, however much weight it takes to bend that rod would be the power rating of the rod. The action rating, or the speed of that rod, is where along that blank that it bends. So does it bend deep into the rod or only part of the way into the rod? So in other words, is it just a rod that bends at the tip? That would be a fast or extra fast rating. If it bends all the way down, that would be a moderate rating, if it's bending down through the middle of the rod or something like that. And with my finesse rods, I want them to be at least fast and maybe extra fast. The power rating is going to depend on the size of the jig head or whatever it is that you're throwing. For a finesse type rod is typically going to be somewhere between a 1/16 and say a 1/4 of an ounce. That's going to be a medium light powered rod for most manufacturers out there. You could go as low as light if you're focused on the trout side of things and you're throwing a lot of really small jigs. And you could go as much as medium if you're throwing heavier, say 1/4 ounce to more, depending on what you're doing for your jigs. You could be up in even a medium power, but almost all my finesse rods are medium light power, and that's key. And I already said they're fast or extra fast, with a strong preference for extra fast. And so that's how I would choose that. But let's say I'm looking at a crankbait rod. Well, now I want something that's, because I'm going to throw and wind, I need a lower modulus of graphite, I need a longer rod so I can throw it a long ways and steer it, and I need a rod that's forgiving so it's softer, meaning that the speed of the rod is lower, so that the whole bunch of the rod acts like a big giant sponge, with something like a fly rod being the ultimate example of that. It acts like a big sponge and absorbs a lot of fish surging, and it will protect your little tiny crankbaits. It also allows fish, which are suction feeders, to get a cleaner bite on your bait. So if you're talking about a hook and wind rod or a bait rod, a lower modulus of graphite and a little bit longer, a longer rod will also help you get better hook sets. So if you're going to throw a bunch of, say you're going to throw weight with power bait on the end of it or catfish bait, and it's going to be way out there, the longer rod will help you sweep more line and get your hook set better. So keep that in mind as well. So when you're looking at rods, don't just pick it up and give it a wiggle. Look at it, and first of all, the modulus of graphite, then look at the length, then look at the power, and then look at the speed or action of the blank. And incidentally, if it only lists one, you'll see commonly on inexpensive rods, it'll just say, 7 feet long, medium action. Well, that doesn't really tell you much about the rod. And so any higher quality rod will dictate both the power and the action. The power will be given to you in a weight rating, and the action will be given to you in a speed rating. Now, the one thing I want to throw out there that's typically tied to the power, and that a lot of times, particularly in older school rods, will tell you the pound test of line that they're designed to throw as well. So it'll say something like 1/4 to 5/8 and 8 to 15 pound test, or 8 to 12 pound test. That is a medium power rod for most manufacturers that I just rattled off right there. That's a medium power rod. But that pound test rating is specifically referencing nylon monofilament. So it goes right out the window if we're talking about braided line. And we're going to talk about braided line here in a minute. But if we're talking about braided line, that's a completely irrelevant rating. So it's strictly the weight of the lures it's designed to throw. So in the case of a medium power, like I just said, it's typically a 1/8 to 5/8 ounce rating. And that right there is the most important part. Other than the length of the rod, you need to have it in the right power rating or it will not perform well for you. So if you're going to throw a 1/4 ounce tube jig a lot, then you want a rod that's a medium power. If you're going to throw an 1/8 ounce jig a lot more, then maybe go on the medium light. And you can hedge yourself because you'll notice that the medium light and the medium will overlap for a lot of it. So you decide what your most common weights are and you go from there. All right, enough on rods. Let's move on from there. One more quick thing on rods. If you're considering buying casting tackle because you've seen it on TV or whatever your situation is, bass guys throw casting reels a lot, that's a whole different discussion in terms of a couple other key things that I think you need to look at as far as that goes. So I'm not going to go into that too much because most of the time, by the time people are buying casting rods, they have a better idea of what they like in a rod or don't like in a rod. But the same rules will apply. They just typically get longer and heavier power ratings is the biggest difference in casting rods and spinning rods. So let's go to reels, and we're going to reference specifically spinning reels here, although it is relevant to casting reels as well. So when you're going to purchase a spinning reel, what am I looking at next? First of all, what rod is it going on? So if it's going to go on a really long rod, maybe a 7.5 foot or something like that, maybe you want a little bit heavier reel just to balance that rod better, or a little bit larger reel as the case might be. But otherwise, I'm going to choose all my reels based on the size of the reel as it relates to the amount of line that I'm putting on it and what kind of line that is. So the only reference I mean by the physical size or weight of the reel is reference to the rod, because if you have an ultralight, you want intuitively to put a very small reel on it. If you have a big heavy powered spinning rod, then you want to have a beefier reel on it. But it will affect how that rod performs because of the balance issue. So what am I looking at with spinning reels first and foremost? That's easy for me, and that is the retrieve ratio of that reel, or the retrieve speed of that reel is one of the key things. And some people will look at and say, oh, well, this reel's 5.2 to 1. And what that means is every time you run the handle in one complete revolution, the spool or the rotor that's wrapping line around the spool will go around 5.2 times for each time you wrap the handle one time. You could also get a reel like the Revo Rockets that I have that are 7.01 to 1 or 7 to 1 or higher than that. And what that means is then that rotor will wrap the spool 7 times or whatever for each time you make the handle go around. But that's not the whole story. The other half of the story is how big is the diameter of that spool. So the relevant thing you want to look at is not what the gear ratio is, it's how many inches per turn is the important part. So that, for me, these days, the faster the reel, the better it is. And that's because it's just more efficient. So I fished, you'll see on my content, a lot of Revo Rockets because they're extremely fast, hence the term rocket. They retrieve line something like 40 plus inches every time my handle goes around. So you want to look at that a bunch. The other thing you want to look at is the diameter of the spool from the standpoint of what line am I going to wrap around it. If I'm going to use nylon monofilament or fluorocarbon, I typically want a larger diameter spool because I end up with less wraps and less very small wraps. The bigger diameter of the spool there are, the less wraps have to come off of that reel when you make a cast. So if you're going to cast 100 feet and your spool's bigger, it has less wraps than if your spool was smaller. So the other thing about that is the nylon, monofilament, and fluorocarbon do not like to be wound in small circles. And braid doesn't care, any kind of braid. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Fireline, spider wire, Durabraid, it doesn't matter. Braided line doesn't care how small of a spool you wind it around. So you don't necessarily need a big spool in that regard. And since I throw the overwhelming majority of my stuff as braid these days, I run smaller diameter spools on all of my stuff. So maybe a size 20 reel instead of a size 30 reel. Now, the other thing that changes though is the surface of the drag. So if you're talking about fish that are going to pull a lot of drag, maybe wipers, big stripers, maybe pike occasionally, although they're not particularly strong, even big ones, and certainly any saltwater fish, then you might consider a larger diameter reel, size 30 or size 40 reel, because you get a larger drag surface. And therefore, the more drag surface you have is like putting bigger brakes on your car. Your car will stop more efficiently, it will generate less heat in the brakes, and that's really important if you're going to get fish that make a long run. So when I go saltwater fishing, on flats fishing, I actually oversize my spinning reels. In that case, I bring pins. But I want big spools, because something like a bonefish, even a little one, a 3 or 4 pounder, is going to take 100 yards of line in one run, or 75 yards of line in one run. And in my experience, there's nothing in freshwater that's going to do that if your tackle's even reasonable for what we're dealing with, other than maybe a sturgeon or something, and then all bets are off. But in terms of bass, walleyes, trout, stuff like that, they're not going to run 100 yards in one direction. So you don't need as much drag surface for that. So keep those in mind with the spinning reel. Other than that, the body could be made out of a lot of different things. I prefer, if at all possible, as much metal in the reel as possible. And then the other thing that you want to feel when you pick it up is the anti-reverse. You want to feel how solid is the anti-reverse. When you try to go backwards, is there play? Is there any slack in it right there? And that's important. If there is, then generally speaking, that's indicative of a less quality reel. The machining quality of the components in there is not as high. And these days, I'll throw out one little tidbit. If reels are available without selectable anti-reverse, meaning you can't turn the anti-reverse bearing off, they are more durable in my experience, and I prefer that in a reel. And that's a newer thing for me in the last few years. But I'm not a fan of back reeling. It's almost not done at all these days, and I've seen more instances of either reels failing because the selectable anti-reverse failed, or that button gets flipped when it's not supposed to, and all kinds of messes happen when your spinning reel goes backwards. So that's why I prefer not having that. So spinning reels. Again, the key thing is the speed, and then the diameter of the spool, and then the material it's made out of, and the anti-reverse bearings. Check those. Moving on. Fishing line. Good general purpose, not a problem. Going to just pick one and go with it. I'm going to go with a nylon monofilament, and it's going to be easy answer for me, Trilene XL, and here's why. Trilene XL is the #1 selling line in the world, has been for a long time. It's good general purpose monofilament, so much so that they own the market with that stuff. There are others out there, all kinds of them. The ones I'm going to tell you to avoid is anything that is a dual polymer line, because they are stiff. Anytime you have the stuff that's a mix of, say, fluorocarbon and nylon, things like that, it's gimmicky. The line is very stiff. It is not what you want. A good general purpose line is basic monofilament. The good thing is it's less expensive. The bad thing is it doesn't last as long. So it will absorb water and UV, and it will break down, so you need to change it out a little bit more. So that's something you need to keep in mind. So a good all-purpose monofilament, Trilene XL is going to get it done. And if you want the easy answer for day in and day out, everything you're doing, that's as good as anything you can do. If you are putting together a finesse type package, like we talked about in the very beginning, maybe a finesse jig package or something like that, or a Texas rig, you're going to be throwing, Texas rig type stuff, or finesse style baits. Maybe you want to go to fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is denser than monofilament, and it sinks, so it will maintain a perfectly straight line, or more of a straight line, I should say, to your bait than will nylon monofilament. It's also, because of that density, it will transmit vibration, meaning you'll feel stuff better with it. And it happens to be roughly the same light refraction characteristics of water, and therefore it's the least visible underwater. Although in my opinion, that's not as big of a deal as it was made out to be when fluorocarbon originally came out. But it is definitely a thing. And for me, it's more about the density and stiffness of it that gives you the feel that gives an advantage to fluorocarbon. Having said that, it definitely of all the lines, it needs the biggest diameter spools. It's the least happy about being wrapped around a spool. And so keep that in mind. The biggest frustration I get is from people running fluorocarbon, and then they can't seem to keep it on the spool. And fluorocarbon has a lot of memory, so keep that in mind. And then from there, braid of any kind. It could be, again, it could be a linear braid, could be a true braided braid, could be a woven braid. There's all different styles of braid. They're all basically made out of the same fibers, Spectra or Dyneema, something along those lines. That's kind of what you're looking at. And for me, probably 90% of my spinning rods these days have braided line on them. I use a whole bunch of different kinds of braid. There's not an easy answer for that. It depends on what I'm doing. But what you'll find is some of them are slightly stiffer, some of them are less stiff, some are better at abrasion, some are not. Some are noisy in the guides. So it just depends on the style. Most of that comes down to whether it's actually braided or twisted or linear and bonded or whatever the case might be with the braided line. But for me, the braided line has more advantages than disadvantages by a large margin, and that's why as time goes on, I get more and more and more married to braided line on spinning rods specifically. So it's the most expensive, but it's also the most durable. So if you're good at not tangling stuff, in other words, you're good at managing slack line and you know how to run your bail manually, which is a huge thing. We've done whole podcasts and videos on that. Check out our YouTube channel on the rod fundamentals. Then braided line's the way to go for a lot of stuff. It's going to give you the maximum sensitivity. It's going to give you the maximum tensile strength as far as pure pulling on it. It's also going to give you the most casting distance. And so those things I keep in mind. Now, let's talk pound test real quickly. If we're talking just general day in and day out, my pound test, if I'm talking monofilament, it's going to be somewhere between 6 and 10 on a spinning rod. And that literally is going to be it. If I need heavier than 10, there's no chance it's going to have anything but braid on it of some sort, because braid's much smaller diameter and much more supple. And when you get nylon or fluorocarbon up over about 10 pounds, it does not handle well on a spinning reel unless it's a monstrous spinning reel like big old saltwater size reel. And that's really not super relevant to my audience. So the braided line will help you if you need heavier pound test. If you need exceptionally light pound tests, then for sure I'd rather have either nylon monofilament or fluorocarbon, because in very small pound tests they actually work better than can super light braids. Super light braids in the say 2 to 8 pound even, or on a little below 8, 2, 4, 6, 8 pound braid. Those things are so thin you can't see them, and they blow around in the wind and this, that, and the other. They can be a little bit tricky to hold knots and all things like that. So if I need 4 pound test, I'm going to either fluorocarbon or monofilament. Nylon monofilament. But if I need 8 pound tests, now it could go any which direction, depending on your personal preferences and what I'm actually doing with the rod. As a general rule, braid gets the nod across the board for me these days. And I think it's worth looking at if you haven't already done so. So when you're standing there and looking at them, go from there. One other thing real quick, high vis, low vis. I generally choose low vis lines, but I'm very diligent about watching my line and using high quality polarized glasses to do so. If you're learning to watch your line, get a higher vis line and don't worry about fish seeing it. That's been overblown in my opinion by a large margin, only because I have tested it specifically by taking high vis lines and tying it to stuff straight and noticing that there's very little difference, if any difference, in the amount of bites that I get. So that's my issue there. So if you want to learn to watch your line, get a really bright colored line, a high vis line, a chartreuse line, something like that. That'll help you out there. So when choosing your stuff there. Now, for day in and day out trout fishing stuff, I'm going to be somewhere between 4 and 8 pound test in a monofilament or fluoro, and I'm going to be somewhere between about 8 and 15 pound test in braided line. And if I'm talking about finesse, bass, walleye, reservoir type fishing, something like that, if I was gonna run nylon or fluoro, then I would be in the 8 to 10 range, occasionally 6. But if I'm gonna run braid, then it's gonna be 8 or 10 as well, because I don't need the extra strength of the bigger line. But if I'm throwing a more active bait like a jerk bait or a crankbait, I'm setting up a rod and reel line for that, then that's going to be in the 12 to 15 pound range because the baits are bigger, it's more of a jarring presentation, and there's no advantage to having the very light braid in that scenario. So my finesse rods, most of them have 8-pound braid on them, some of them have 10. If I'm fishing on really rocky stuff, I will fish fluoro or nylon, typically fluoro, and it will be in 6, maybe 8, and then but no 10. And then if I'm up from there, then it's almost always going straight to braid. So hopefully that'll help you out with that. Now, let's talk quickly about lures, and I want to be real quick on this one. When it comes to lures, if you're going to buy multiples of anything, buy them in opposite colors for starters. And the reason of that is it gives you the most versatility. If you find it's a lure you really like, then get a bunch of colors. But in the beginning, get a light one and a dark one and see if you really want that lure or not in the long run once you go fish with it. If in doubt and you're buying, let's say, 2 different hard baits, right? You're going to buy 2 different crankbaits. Buy a deeper one and a shallower one, again, so that you can mix up your presentations as much as possible. So when you're building your tackle boxes in the early stages of your career and you're filling up boxes, what I want to see is the most diversity. So I want to see a medium, rather than say 10 colors of crankbaits, I'd rather see you have 2 colors of crankbaits, but have them in 3 depth ranges so that I have shallow, medium, and deep divers each in 2 colors. And now I only have 6 baits instead of having 10 of colors, because depth range almost always, and action will trump colors. Colors are one of the last things I consider when it comes to lures. And so get them in different depth ranges if you're talking about something like a hard bait. If you're talking about jig heads, more important to have 16th, 8th, quarter, whatever, have the sizes than again to have them in a bunch of colors. So once again, focus on making sure you have a few of each size rather than the same size in a bunch of colors. Now, if you're like Dan Swanson, love you Dan, close friend, guided with me forever. If you're Dan, you're gonna have 50 of each color, but you got a 21-foot boat to haul it around in. If you're building your tackle, don't worry about the colors. Make sure you have a few of the sizes. And something that's for sure snaggy, like a jig head, make sure you have more of them with you. Something like a jerkbait, I might literally have one and fish it for years. But something like a jig head, you're going to lose some of them. And if you're not fishing them tight enough to the bottom. So make sure you have multiples in whatever it is. So for instance, for me, an 1/8-ounce jig head standard, gotta have it, gonna have a bunch of them in the boat all the time. And it's because I might go through 6 or 8 or 10 of them in a day pretty easy. And fortunately, they're not terribly expensive. And so that's just part of that deal. But if you're talking about jig heads, multiple sizes. Same thing with hooks. You don't want a whole bunch of the same size, get different sizes. And usually, even if you run out on a trip somewhere, it's not going to be a huge difference to make a hook a slightly bigger, slightly smaller. So make sure you've got them in a couple of different sizes, more than a whole bunch of any one size. If you're talking about things like spinner baits or inline spinners, again, opposite colors. Get a bright colored one and a natural colored one. You know, maybe a natural colored one being a brown or a dark green of some sort, like what they would call green pumpkin, something like that. Could be a black. And around baitfish, it could be even a white color. But a hot color that I'm talking about would be something like a fire tiger or orange or chartreuse, something like that. Both of them have their places in terms of colors. But when you're buying them to build out your arsenal, pay attention to the size and all of that of the spinner first. And then when you buy them, buy one in opposite colors, and therefore you can cover your range. If you find out that you really like the natural colored one the most, well, then go buy more of them. But in the beginning, while you're learning and you're building out your tackle, buy them in opposite colors. Buy one of each in opposite colors, and that'll help you out a bunch. Same thing with spoons, only in that case, I would say something like a shiny one and then a painted one. And then when the sun's out, you throw the shiny one. And when the water's all dirty or it's darker out and the sun's not out, then you throw the painted one. But again, they're an opposite, and you spread your buying dollars out. And that way, that one little Plano tackle box you have, it might only have 25, 30 lures in it, but you can cover a huge range of things with those lures, and that's what the goal is for me all the time, is to be able to cover as many scenarios I run into on the water. If you're a bait guy, maybe your hooks don't change fundamentally because your baits are similar, but the weight that you need to throw changes a bunch. So now I'm again gonna have a couple of weights in each size that I might need, and that's gonna spread my versatility out a bunch more. So you're just thinking about it when it comes to lures. I could go on and on and on about lures and weights and all that, but when it comes to that, just think about it in terms of having them cover as many scenarios as you can. And if you've got a brown one and a dark green one, those are the same as far as I'm concerned. It's close enough that the fish aren't going to notice any difference, right? But if you've got a brown one and a white one, well, okay, now you're covering different scenarios. Or if you've got a crankbait that dives, 1 foot and then or 2 foot, and then the next one dives 7 foot, and the next one dives 12 foot, well, you've covered a whole bunch of scenarios in those 3 crankbaits, and that's why I talk about that kind of stuff like that. So pick your rod, pick your reel, pick your line, and pick your lures with the eye on what you're doing with them, and you will be a whole bunch better off. And the last thing I'm going to close with is this. If you're a guy that's already got rods and you're developed a certain presentations that you're really getting into, the way I like to pair up my rod, reels, lines is I choose the lure first. I've talked about this a ton. First, you choose the lure, because then I know how heavy it is. I know whether I'm going to retrieve it or I'm going to, barely be playing with it on the bottom and trying to finesse fish with it, or whatever the case might be. So I choose the lure first. Then I will choose the line that I'm going to throw it on. Then I will choose the rod that's most appropriate for that, and then the reel from there. So that's the scenario in which I put them together. So if you're going backwards and you say, I need a crankbait rod, look at your crankbaits and go, well, most of my crankbaits are between 1/4 and 1/2 ounce. Okay, well, that's an easy range, right? And then we know you're going to be rewinding those constantly, so you can get a lower modulus of graphite. We know you're going to want to throw them a long ways, because typically that's a standard deal with crankbaits. So you know you need a little bit longer rod, and then when it comes to line, you can decide, as far as that goes from there, what kind of line you want to throw them on. And I like to throw crankbaits on fluorocarbon, and so fluorocarbon is going to dictate to me what I go from there. So hopefully that helps you choose the lure, then the line, then the rod, then the reel, and you'll be better off. So next time you're standing in a Sportsman's Warehouse trying to decide what to buy, hopefully that will help you out to make better decisions, spread your money out. So specific questions, let me know. Chat at fishfulthinker.com or message me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, or wherever, all at Fishful Thinker. We'd appreciate that very much. So thanks for tuning in. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.